Hello, and welcome to this tour of the trees on the Michigan Tech campus. I'm R.J. Laverne from the College of Forest Resources and Environmental Science at Michigan Tech, where I graduated in 1980. Our tour will focus on the trees found in the Central Campus area. You can find well over 40 species of trees on campus, and while we won't have time to visit all of them, I'll show you a variety of familiar tree species that can be found throughout the Keweenaw Peninsula, as well as some not so common species that come to us from around the world. We've prepared a tree tour map that shows the locations and species of the trees that we will visit on the tour, plus many others. This map and a PDF of this presentation can be found at mtu.edu/reunion. Before we head out to campus, let's take a couple of minutes for a quick start to tree identification. These easy tips will help you quickly narrow down the choices when you look at the trees in your neighborhood and ask, I wonder what that tree is. There are lots of great tree field guides, and one of the best is Michigan Trees by Bert Barnes and Warren Wagner. The line drawing illustrations you'll see in this presentation come primarily from this book. The first and easiest step in tree identification is to determine if the tree is a conifer or broadleaf, or more precisely, if the tree is a gymnosperm or an angiosperm. So what's the difference? Gymnosperms include all of the conifers, such as pines, spruces, and firs. Angiosperms include all, except one, of the broadleaf trees, such as maples, oaks, and cherries. Most, but not all, conifers are evergreen, and most, but not all, broadleaf trees are deciduous, meaning that they drop all of their leaves every fall. Unless I'm in the lumber yard, I avoid using the terms softwoods and hardwoods interchangeably with conifer and broadleaf. As previously mentioned, step one is easy. Does the tree have needles and cones, in which case it's a gymnosperm, or more commonly called a conifer, or does it have broad leaves, in which case it is most likely an angiosperm, or a broadleaf tree? As with most situations, there are exceptions. The ginkgo tree has broad leaves, so it looks like an angiosperm, but it's actually more closely related to the conifers and is considered a gymnosperm. It is deciduous and drops its leaves each fall. Let's look at the conifers more closely, particularly the arrangement of needles on a twig. There are single needles, groups of needles, and needles that aren't needle-like at all. Some conifers, and in particular most of the pines and the larches, have needles in groups. These are called fascicles that are attached to the twigs. For the pines, the number of needles per group is frequently characteristic of the species. For example, eastern white pine has 5 needles in each bundle, where Scotch pine has 2 needles in each bundle. The larches, for example tamarack, have needles in bundles of 10 to 20 that all drop every fall. Most conifers, including spruce, fir, hemlock, Douglas fir, yew, and others, have individual needles attached to the twigs. Here's a hint to help you separate spruces from firs. Look very closely at the base of a needle and take note of how it's attached to the twig. If the needle base has a tiny wood peg that is attached to the twig, it's a spruce. If the needle looks like it has a tiny suction cup attached to the twig, it's a fir. Some conifers have very short needles that are clustered around the twig. These short needles look like tiny awls or scales. Examples include northern white cedar, also called arborvitae, and eastern red cedar. Most of the conifers hold on to at least 1 year's foliage for the entire year, some as many as several years' needles, and therefore they are considered evergreens. These are two examples of conifers that are deciduous. Bald cypress and dawn redwood both drop all of their feathery needles each fall after turning a bright rusty orange. There is much more variability in the foliage of the broadleaf trees. For field identification, broadleaf trees can be divided into two groups, with a few oddballs, as determined by their leaf arrangement. Most broadleaf trees have leaves and buds that are alternately spaced along the twig. A few genera have pairs of leaves that are attached opposite of one another. The trick that many arborists use to remember which genera of trees have this opposite arrangement is mad bucking horse. MAD, M-A-D, stands for maple, ash, and dogwood. They all have opposite leaf attachments. Bucking reminds us of the Buckeyes, and horse reminds us of their close relative, the horse chestnuts, that also have an opposite leaf arrangement. Here is an example of a maple with opposite leaf attachment. Note how the buds and the leaves are attached to the twig in pairs. Not only are the leaves and buds in an opposite arrangement, but most of the twigs and branches will also exhibit an opposite arrangement. So it's easy to tell the leaf arrangement of a tree even from a distance. This adds greatly in winter tree identification. This is a twig from an American elm. Here the leaves are attached to the twig in an alternate pattern. There are some trees, including the catalpas, that have their leaves arranged not in pairs, but rather in trios of leaves arranged around the twigs. We call this a whorled leaf arrangement. Step 3 for quick tree identification once again pertains to the leaves of broadleaf trees. Many familiar trees, including the oaks and birches, have simple leaves, meaning that they have one leaf blade per leaf. Some trees have more than one leaf blade per leaf. They have multiple leaflets attached to a central stem that is attached to the twig. These are compound leaves. How can you tell if a leaf blade is a simple leaf or one of several leaflets of a compound leaf? Look at the base of the stem of the leaf or leaflet. A simple leaf will be accompanied by a bud at the base of the petiole. Leaflets of a compound leaf will have no buds at their base, but the central stem onto which the leaflets are attached, the petiole of the compound leaf, will have a bud at its base. Genera with compound leaves include the ashes, nut trees like the hickories and walnuts, and box elder, which, unlike most of its maple relatives, does not have simple leaves. Caution! Don't get fooled into thinking you see opposite leaf arrangement if the leaflets are opposite of one another. In most cases, these compound leaves have an alternate leaf arrangement. Look for the position of the buds on the twigs. Here's a leaf from a green ash attached to a twig. How can we tell that this is a compound leaf with 7 leaflets and not 7 individual leaves? There are no buds at the base of the leaflets. The single bud is at the base of the petiole. Here we have a twig from a sugar maple tree. Each leaf has a bud at the base of every stem or petiole, so we know these are simple leaves. Here are the several different types of compound leaves. Singly or pinnately compound like the ash on the left, doubly or bipinnately compound like the Kentucky coffee tree in the middle, and palmate compound like the horse chestnut on the right. We've focused primarily on the foliage of trees as indicators of tree species, but there are many other characteristics of trees that provide valuable clues to species identification, including the flowers, the fruit and seeds, the buds, the bark, and even the site that the tree is growing in, including the climate zone, hydrology, and the soils. You may have noticed that some of the photos look like there's a coin in the picture. I've included a quarter in the pictures of foliage and cones to provide a familiar size scale. Also, you'll notice a letter in brackets in the upper right-hand corner. These are the species location codes that are on the tree tour map. Okay, so let's head out to campus and look for our first tree. And it's appropriate that our first tree species is the state tree of Michigan, and one of the two most important tree species in the region. It's the eastern white pine. You'll find one of many white pines just to the southeast of Husky Plaza. And there's also a nice grove to the west side of the ROTC building. Remember that we said the pines have needles that are attached to the twig in bundles or fascicles? Eastern white pine is the only species in the region that has needles in bundles of 5. The cones are relatively long, up to 6 inches, but fairly narrow. It's the tallest growing species in Michigan, and loggers in the 1700s were drawn to northern Michigan to harvest white pines to use as ship masts. As you drive through Michigan and see a tree with wide sweeping branches that's head and shoulders above all the other trees, you're looking at an eastern white pine. To me, these tall trees look like they stood up in church and are raising their arms toward heaven. We'll get to another really important tree species at the end of our tour. Near Husky Plaza at the northeast corner of Van Pelt Library, we find a balsam fir tree. Balsam fir is an evergreen conifer that's native to Michigan. It has soft, round-tipped needles that are arranged on either side of the twig, not on all sides of the twig. If you look closely at the base of the needles, it looks like it's attached to the twig with a tiny suction cup. This is different from the spruces. The cones are pretty small, only about an inch or so long, and the bark is smooth gray with lots of sap-filled blisters. If we move to the front of the library near the entrance, we'll find a Norway maple. As the name suggests, Norway maples are not native to North America. Some Norway maples that you'll see in neighborhoods and parks will have purple leaves. These are cultivars of Norway maple that are grown specifically for their purple color. The leaves of Norway maple look very similar to our native sugar maple. But Norway maple leaves tend to be a bit wider than they are tall, unlike the sugar maple. But like sugar maple, Norway maple leaves have smooth edges, unlike the serrated edges of a red maple. One Norway maple clue is if you pick a leaf and then squeeze the end of the stem or petiole, you'll see a little white milky drop of sap. Also, the buds look like the beaks of tiny puffins. To the west of Husky Plaza, we find a little leaf linden, which is a non-native species related to our native basswood. Little leaf linden has somewhat round leaves with serrated edges and a pointy tip. The leaves and buds are arranged in an alternate pattern, and the leaves and buds are asymmetric. They're lopsided. The seeds are attached to stems that have a leaf-shaped bract that turns brown and holds on throughout the winter. On the northwest corner of the library, we find an American elm tree. There's an even larger elm on the southwest corner of Fisher Hall. This is the species that was hit so hard with Dutch elm disease in the 1960s and 70s. The leaves of American elm are fairly large and have a sandpapery feel. Look closely at the leaf edge and you'll see 2 different alternating sizes of teeth. Also, the base of the leaf is asymmetric. One side is usually larger than the other. A diagnostic feature of American elm is the bark. Carefully remove a plate of bark and look at the alternating layers of chocolate and vanilla colors. No other elm has this. On the west side of the library, we find a Freeman maple, which is actually a cross between a red maple and a silver maple that we'll both see in a bit. Note how the edges of the leaf are serrated, unlike the smooth leaf edges we saw on the Norway maple. Near the southwest corner of the library is a tree we wouldn't expect to find in Houghton. It's a Kentucky coffee tree. It has doubly pinnate leaves with dozens of sub-leaflets that comprise a single leaf like we see here. Don't let the opposite sub-leaflets fool you. The leaves are alternately attached on very stout but sparse branches. The seeds are in large flat bean pods, and there is fossil evidence that these seeds were a favorite food of the extinct mastodons and woolly mammoths. And in fact, the seeds won't germinate unless they are cracked open like the chewing action of a mastodon, digested, and deposited out of the rear end. A little arboricultural folklore there. On the southwest corner of the library, we find a hawthorn tree, possibly a Washington hawthorn. The genus Crataegus, the hawthorns, includes thousands of species and subspecies that freely hybridize, making identification of individual species quite a challenge. Hawthorns are small to medium-sized trees with simple alternate leaves that usually have serrated edges. As the name suggests, the hawthorns are usually equipped with stiff, sharp thorns that can do some damage if you happen to stab yourself. As if to offset the serious armor, these trees produce delicate white flowers in the spring. Near the hawthorn on the southwest corner of the library, we find a Scotch pine. As the name suggests, it's not native to North America. We can tell it's a pine because the needles are in groups, in this case pairs. The needles are about 2 to 3 inches in length, and they're somewhat twisted. The cones are relatively small, a bit larger than a golf ball. But the feature most characteristic of Scotch pine is the cinnamon-colored bark on the upper trunk and branches. Let's continue along the southeast corner of the library toward what may be the most massive tree on campus. It's the huge eastern cottonwood. The species Populus deltoides gets its name from the triangular or delta-shaped leaves that flutter in the wind. This fluttering action is due to the flat leaf stem or petiole that twists in the wind, similar to the cottonwood's close relative quaking aspen. The common name comes from the large amount of cottony fiber the tree produces each spring that carries the tiny seeds on the wind. Turning northward between the library and Recce Hall, we find a pair of small Japanese tree lilacs. Not native to Michigan, you're most likely to find these trees in maintained landscapes. The leaves are very similar in shape to the familiar native lilac, somewhat heart-shaped with smooth edges, but alternate in arrangement, unlike the opposite arrangement of lilac. Clusters of white showy flowers appear in the spring that turn to brown as the seeds develop. A bit further north, next to the east side of the library, is Astrea virginiana, a small tree known locally as ironwood, but also called hop hornbeam. It's a native tree that can be found in the UP forests. It has leaves a little bit like elm leaves, alternately arranged with doubly serrated edges. It gets the common name hop hornbeam from the shape of the seed clusters that look like the hops used in beers. Toward the northwest corner of Recce Hall is a familiar tree to the Upper Peninsula, the northern red oak. The group of red oaks, including northern red oak, have pointy tips to the leaf lobes, unlike the rounded tips of the leaf lobes in the group of white oaks. Northern red oak foliage is similar to pin oak, but the sinuses of northern red oak leaves, those are the cutout regions between the leaf lobes. Those sinuses in northern red oak dip in about halfway to the leaf midrib. In pin oaks, these sinuses cut deeper, about 3/4 of the way to the midrib. Another good way to identify northern red oak is the shape of the acorn cap. To me, the acorn cap looks like a flat cap of a cab driver, unlike the acorn caps that more fully hold the acorn. Here's a quiz for you foresters. Why is the Upper Peninsula about as far north as oaks grow? Well, northern red oaks go a little bit farther north. And why is it that sugar maple grows much farther north? Well, it's because of the size of the vessels in the wood that transport water in the trees. Here we see the end grain, the transverse or cross-sectional surface from a red oak and from a sugar maple. The oaks build really big pipes in the spring to transport a lot of water, and later in the summer these vessels are built much smaller. This is an example of a ring porous tree. The sugar maple builds very thin vessels both in spring and summer. This is an example of a diffuse porous tree. The problem is that if a late frost occurs in the spring, the water freezes in the oak's huge vessels, causing air bubbles to form. Think of this like an aneurysm. In maples, since the vessels are thin, if the water freezes, only tiny bubbles form that are quickly reabsorbed and transpiration continues. So, oaks don't do as well in cold climates as sugar maple. Our next tree is near the southwest corner of Recce Hall, and you'll find another fine specimen on the south side of the Memorial Union. Want to have some fun? Well, say the botanical name for our next tree, Pseudotsuga menziesii. That's the genus and species for Douglas fir. The common name is hyphenated because it's not a true fir, but the foliage is similar to the needles we saw on balsam fir. Douglas fir is native to the Rocky Mountain region and the Pacific Northwest, where it grows to giant dimensions. Douglas fir is a major timber species. The foliage of Douglas fir is similar to the true firs in that the tips of the needles are rounded, unlike the sharp tips of spruce needles. But the distinguishing feature of Douglas fir are the cones. They're not particularly big, 2 to 3 inches, but they have interesting papery bracts that look like little snake tongues that extend beyond the cone scales. If you liked saying Pseudotsuga menziesii, you'll like our next tree too. The botanical name is Coelrotaria paniculata. It's the golden rain tree. This is a small ornamental tree introduced from Asia. It has compound leaves that can be either pinnate or bipinnate, with many subleaflets comprising a single leaf like we see here on the right. The notable features of this tree are the showy yellow flowers that bloom in the spring, followed by unique papery hollow seed pods that resemble Chinese lanterns like we see here on the left. You can find this tree on the south side of Recce Hall. If you've driven along any country road in Michigan, it's likely you've seen our next tree, which is usually more of a shrub. It's the staghorn sumac, and you can find this one between Van Pelt Library and Recce Hall. Staghorn sumac has large compound leaves with 20 or more leaflets. It gets its name from the reddish clusters of fuzzy seed pods that resemble a deer's fuzzy antlers. On the east side of Recce Hall and near the southwest corner of Fisher Hall, we find a ginkgo tree, also called the maidenhair tree. This is the ancient tree that was around with the dinosaurs. It's the rare gymnosperm with fan-shaped leaves instead of needles. It's also a relatively rare species that has distinct male and female trees, with fruit forming only on the female trees. When these fruits get ripe and drop from the branches, they develop a particularly offensive odor. Think of stepping into a dog pile. Ew! Let's take a quick detour to the southwest corner of Dillman Hall to see one of my favorite species. It's the northern white cedar, otherwise known as arborvitae. It's found throughout the Upper Peninsula wherever there's a swamp, muskeg, or low forest. It's the primary source of food and shelter for deer in the winter, as herds will gather in the cedar swamps. It's an evergreen with scales instead of needles, arranged in fan-like sprays. The cones are very small and numerous. Crush a bit of foliage in your hand and you'll be treated to a delightful scent of pines mixed with oranges. You won't have to go to a swamp to see this species. Chances are you or your neighbors have this same species as a shrub or a hedgerow. Here's a sidebar for you woodworkers. Northern white cedar has lightweight but very durable wood that is a creamy white in color. It's the preferred species for making log homes and furniture. Here's my attempt at making log beds out of cedar. One natural and one stained gray. You know, I kind of like the natural. But when the client says they want it gray, you make it gray. Let's skip to another point in the Central Campus. In the circle south of the southwest corner of the Chemical Sciences and Engineering building, we can find a silver maple tree. Silver maples are typically found in lowland forests and urban environments because they can tolerate poor soils and polluted air. Similar to red maples, they have saw-toothed serrated edges on their leaves, but the sinuses, the notches in between the lobes, are deeper than in red maple. And their seed helicopters are quite large and fly first thing in the spring. Here's another pine. You'll find this one just to the northwest of Husky Plaza, near the southwest corner of the Electrical Energy Resource Center. It's red pine, which is native to and found throughout northern Michigan, where it is an important timber species. As you'll see, red pine looks a lot like the next pine we'll see, Austrian pine. The needles are long and in bundles of 2. The cones can get quite large, about the size of a tennis ball. Let's jump over to the southwest corner of the Mechanical Engineering Mechanics building so that I can show you the pine that resembles red pine. It's an Austrian pine, and as the name suggests, it's not native to Michigan. Austrian pine looks a lot like our native red pine. The needles are long and in bundles of 2. The cones can get quite large and somewhat egg-shaped. Austrian pines are frequently planted as landscape trees, but unfortunately they're very susceptible to the fungus Diplodia, which attacks the foliage. The easiest way to tell the difference between an Austrian pine and a red pine is to bend the needles in half. The Austrian pine needles will crease, but will mostly bounce back. Red pine needles will partially break and will not bounce back. On our way toward the academic office building, we find a horse chestnut tree. It's not really a chestnut, although the nut looks similar to our native chestnut. It's much more closely related to the Buckeyes. Horse chestnuts have large palmate compound leaves with very large and sticky buds on the twigs. The tree produces white flowers in the spring, followed by prickly husks that enclose the nut. The tree outside of Anne Frank's window that she wrote about in her diary was a horse chestnut. A Colorado blue spruce is located in front of the ROTC building. As the name suggests, this species is native to the Rocky Mountain region, but is frequently planted as a landscape tree throughout North America due to its attractive bluish foliage. The youngest needles have the blue cast. As the needles age, they turn green. The needles are sharply pointed, stiff and prickly, and are arranged on all sides of the twigs. The cones are papery and are similar to Norway spruce cones, but typically smaller. In front of the south side of the academic office building is a Zelkova tree that is native to Asia. The leaves of Zelkova look a bit like elm leaves, but they're more narrow and pointed. Because of the similarity and its vase-shaped crown, it was thought to be a suitable replacement for American elm, but it doesn't get nearly as large. The branches typically originate from a congested area of the trunk, making the branch attachments somewhat prone to breaking. Here's a fun tree that you can find in front of the academic office building, a large one on the southwest corner and a smaller, more touchable one on the southeast corner. It's the white fir, which is native to the Rocky Mountain region. It's fun because it almost invites you to touch it. White fir has relatively long, bluish needles. The needles in the twigs are quite soft and rubbery, and once you feel them, you'll be tempted to pet the branches like a friendly cat. Like other firs, the needles have tiny suction cup attachments to the twigs, and the cones form in an upright fashion. Over on the east side of the academic office building, we can see a London plane tree. London plane tree is a cross between our native sycamore and the non-native Asian plane tree. Like sycamore, this is a large tree with beautiful peeling bark, but the bark of native sycamore appears closer to white, while London plane tree bark may appear minty green. The leaves are similar to maple, but arranged alternately on the twigs. The leaves can get much bigger than the leaf pictured here, as large as your open hand and then some. One way to tell the difference between London plane tree and sycamore is to look at the round seed pods. In sycamore, there is only one seed pod per stem. London plane tree will have more than one seed pod per stem. Next to the London plane tree is a white spruce, which is native to Michigan. It has relatively short needles, about an inch long, and they're pointy and attached to all sides of the twig, unlike the firs that we've seen. The cones are also relatively small, maybe 2 inches long, but the scales are stiffer than in Norway spruce or Colorado spruce. Between the academic office building and the ROTC building, there stands a Norway spruce. As the name suggests, it's not native to North America, but it's a very important lumber species in Europe. The most notable feature of Norway spruce is how the needles and twigs droop and hang from the branches. The needles look similar to Douglas fir, but are sharply pointed like Colorado spruce. The cones are typically larger than Colorado spruce and have somewhat soft papery scales. Here's a good place to compare the cones of some of the conifers we find on campus. Eastern white pine are long, relatively thin with stiff scales. Norway spruce can be just as large, but have smaller, thinner scales. Colorado spruce are similar to Norway spruce with fragile papery scales, but are smaller than Norway spruce. Douglas fir are typically about 2 to 3 inches long, and they have the unique bracts that extend beyond the scales like papery tongues. White spruce cones are relatively small, but their scales are fairly stiff and durable. Scotch pine are golf ball sized with stiff scales, and Austrian pine are somewhat egg-shaped and can get much larger than this cone. And just for good measure, here's the relatively small cone of the eastern larch or tamarack tree. Here's the last tree on our tour, and you'll find many of these trees on campus and throughout the forests of Michigan. It's the sugar maple, also called hard maple for you woodworkers, and because of its beautiful hard wood, it is the most highly prized timber species in the Upper Peninsula. You'll see this one on the west side of the Memorial Union. You'll recognize this as the leaf from the Canadian flag. It has smooth edges on the leaf similar to Norway maple, and unlike the serrated edges of the red and silver maples. The seed helicopters fly later than the other maples, usually in late summer. The wood is hard, strong, and quite beautiful, frequently used for furniture and basketball courts. The distinctive pattern of bird's eye maple wood, which develops in sugar maple, is highly prized around the world. And maybe best of all, its sap is the source of maple syrup. Here's a good place to compare features of the maples we've seen. Sugar maple and Norway maple leaves are similar. They have pointy lobes, but the leaf edges between the lobes are smooth. Norway maple leaves are usually wider than they are tall, where sugar maple leaves are about as tall as they are wide. And don't forget to look for the milky white sap in the leaf petioles of Norway maples. Red and silver maples both have serrated edges on the leaves, but silver maple leaves have deeper lobes. The seed helicopters are also useful in identifying the maples. Silver maple has the biggest helicopters, up to 3 inches in length, that form in tight V-shaped angles, and they fly early in the growing season. Red maple helicopters fly pretty early as well, but they are typically smaller than silver maple seeds. Norway maple has fairly large helicopters that form in wide-angled pairs. They fly in early to midsummer. And sugar maple helicopters fly later than the others, and they form in U-shaped pairs. That's all the time we have for our tree tour, but feel free to explore the many additional tree species on campus whenever you're in town. There are many excellent field guides available. One set that I would recommend is the 2-volume Trees of Western North America and Trees of Eastern North America by Richard Spellenberg, Christopher Earle, and Gil Nelson. These are from the Princeton Field Guide series. Another field guide I highly recommend is the Sibley Guide to Trees by David Allen Sibley. And while it is much too large to serve as a field guide, the Manual of Woody Landscape Plants by Michael Durr is an incredibly detailed resource for tree identification, including a great deal of information on individual cultivars and varieties. And for the trees specifically of the Great Lakes region, I highly recommend the book Michigan Trees. And I still reach for the first 2 field guides I ever bought, namely Michigan Trees by Charles Otis, the precursor to the book by Barnes and Wagner, and A Field Guide to Trees and Shrubs by George A. Petrides. My sincere thanks to these 2 students and gifted teachers of dendrology for inspiring my love of trees. I hope you've enjoyed our campus tree tour. Feel free to contact me with tree-related questions. You can reach me through my Michigan Tech email, rlaverne@mtu.edu. You can also reach me at the Davie Tree Expert Company at rjlaverne@davie.com. I'll be happy to talk trees and trade forestry stories with you. Thanks for watching.